Let's begin.
Hey there, scary story fanatics! Welcome back to Cleaving Thought from Bone with your host, Sociopathic. The government has its hands in all kinds of things these days, but some agencies operate behind closed doors. Want your license to kill? Well, start by simply surviving tonight's dreadful little tale that Doughboy420 likes to call, "A picture is worth 1,000 words."
In the early days of the photograph, there were many people attempting to perfect the photography process. It at first took hours or even days of exposure through the lens to create any kind of picture. Great minds worked on the processes of exposing light to various chemicals in order to etch their image onto some other medium. Schultz in the 1700s, Wedgwood and Davy in the 1800s, then advanced by Niepce and Daguerre, whose ideas would develop a process that would take only minutes. Those were the glorious times, and it is believed that sometime around this period is when this piece was developed.
The auctioneer spoke as a young woman wheeled a cart out onto the stage. The cart was covered by a black satin sheet, and upon the top of that was an old paper photograph that was encased in a glass, held in place by a firm wooden stand. The photograph was of a man, grimacing, contorted in pain. He appeared very old, laying in bed with no clothes on, covered from the waist down by only a sheet, his skin wrinkled and shriveled into his body, his skin pale and dirty. Although the subject matter was gruesome in nature to begin with, there was something far more sinister about it. There appeared to be another image overlaid faintly onto the image, as though another person was there in the bed for a few moments, so that the camera could just barely capture their image before the original subject once again reprised his role in the same position of discomfort.
It is believed that this image is one of the oldest examples of photography in the world. It is estimated to have taken roughly 1 hour of exposure. The subject is a wealthy individual, an explorer and entrepreneur, whose family wanted a photograph of him before his passing. The subject passed away while the photograph was developing inside the camera. It is thought that the contorted image is the result of the man's soul being captured exiting his body.
The auctioneer spoke once more before he began the bidding.
Bidding starts at 10,000. Do I have 10?
The auctioneer spoke, causing a young gentleman in the front row to raise his paddle.
I have 10 from number 15 in the front. Do I have 20?
The auctioneer continued, prompting an elderly gentleman toward the back to raise his number.
We have 20 from number 37 in the back. Do we have 30? Do we have 30?
The auctioneer continued, various people bidding upon the item. The auction was the estate sale of an extremely rich man in upstate New York. He was very old and very bitter. He collected things on the side of the macabre, haunted objects, murder memorabilia. It was probably that obsession that had got him, and pretty much his entire family, murdered as well, making his own murder the obsession of some other twisted soul. But surprisingly enough, that had absolutely nothing to do with this subject, though it didn't cause the price to drop either. This object was something else entirely, something that, if the bidders had only known what it entailed, they would have never even looked at it in the first place.
Going once, going twice, sold for $250,000 to number 23.
The auctioneer said, motioning toward a man in the crowd. The man that had just bought the photograph was quite a dapper-looking gentleman. He had an aura of high-class sophistication about him, his nose in the air as to not smell the stink of the common folk. A real snob of a man. His hair was peppered with gray, and he wore small, metal-framed glasses that rested atop his pointed, upturned nose. He had a gaunt appearance to him, his cheeks sunken in, his skin clinging to bone. The man was not very old, only about in his 50s or so, but he appeared to be much older, probably due to disease, or perhaps something had attached itself to him through his collection of cursed artifacts. But he was quite pleased to get his hands upon this one-of-a-kind piece, regardless of his health. The auction had several more interesting items, but there was only one I had come for. After the bidding had ended, my associates and I followed the man to where he was to pick up his newly bought items, and then we followed his caravan of vehicles back to his home to watch them unload the artifacts into his large mansion of modern design. The clean angles of today drastically contrasting the historical artifacts of the macabre that lay within. The man had quite a bit of security, but we knew if we just waited, the time would come when their numbers had dwindled down to a mere few. That was the nature of this photograph, after all. It was not long before we had heard the man's blood-curdling scream from the upper floor of the house, signaling us to begin our approach as the security guards all stormed in before us. As my associates and I approached the building with our guns drawn, we heard a second and then a third scream, followed by gunshots, and then silence. It was then that we knew that all of the security guards were either dead and consumed, or would soon be fleeing out the front door to run for their lives. We simply stood off to the side of the door and waited for two large men to come bursting through the door, nearly knocking it off its hinges, where we quickly disposed of them with bullets in the back. No one ever knew we were there. We made our way through the house to a room upstairs, where we found the photograph doing its work. We watched what appeared to be a decaying man, his skin melting and slopping off of his body and onto the floor. He was completely bald, aside from a few long, gray strands of hair that appeared wet and slick. His upper body could be seen from approximately mid-chest level, with only one arm outward, and the other arm and rest of his body was stretched thin and hidden inside the reaches of the photograph's frame. This decayed man's head was tilted upward, his mouth agape and opening wide, where his jagged, rotten teeth were digging deeply into the skull of a terrified security guard. The man appeared to be in shock, hyperventilating, with a far-off look in his eyes as the monster crunched down upon his skull, attempting to crush him down into smaller sizes so that he could be swallowed whole. The decaying beast's mouth, like that of a snake, its jaw dislocating and stretching to fit over the man's cranium. While all this was happening, the creature's arm was extended downward, clawed, rotten fingers decaying to show visible bone beneath, dug into the guard's chest. The poor man's skin twisted and boiled around the presence of the invading hand, appearing to melt and be drawn into the fingers that dug into him. The beast was consuming this man's very being. I then looked around the room to find that there was blood and viscera everywhere, pieces of guts and gray matter, all strewn and flung about the room, making it a disgusting crimson mess. And when I turned back to the site of the monster, only a mere moment later, already half of a man's body had been consumed by the beast. This was unfortunately followed by the remainder of the man's form swelling with blood, his skin turning a purplish red color as his body bloated around it, before he finally popped like a giant infected zit, causing his innards to be spattered about the room onto everything, including us. One of my associates retched and nearly vomited from being drenched in the guts of some unfortunate soul, but he managed to keep his composure as the decayed man slipped back into the inner reaches of the death photograph. I had seen some things while doing my job, some very awful things, so I had taught myself to be unaffected by them. I had learned to be numb to them, so it was almost of no event to me. I simply covered the photograph with a nearby sheet that was relatively clean and free of blood and tucked it into my bag, as I had come here to do. Then the lot of us simply walked out and returned to the facility without any further incident.
Thank you for your service, Operative. You will be paid in full.
An older woman spoke, the two of them sitting in a debriefing room with cameras rolling to document everything for study. Upon delivery of the object, two men had taken the bag that held the photograph into their custody to then take it to the observation room where the facility scientists and experts would study it, hopefully without incident. But at a place like Icarus, there was no such thing as safety.
What is this thing?
My friend Todd asked. It's a photograph. Don't look directly into it, though. It's not really pleasant from what I hear, I answered.
After the stuff we've seen here, doubt it,
Todd said. No, really, if you look directly into it, this decayed man comes out and eats you, I said.
Oh, I see,
Todd said, deciding to take a little more caution with the old piece of paper.
So how are we supposed to observe it?
He then asked. Just don't look directly into it. At an angle, you're fine, and you can see it through a camera, but just don't look at it directly. I heard the operative that obtained this thing. It ain't pretty, I told him.
We've been getting some pretty freaky stuff ever since we got new management. I mean, I've seen some shit. When I was 16, I went out with my friends to...
Todd began, but I stopped him mid-story. Shh. You know we aren't allowed to talk about anything outside of here. How we got here. Who we are. None of that. So let's just stay focused on work, I informed him.
Yeah, I know. Anyway, I'm just saying. I've been around the block with crazy stuff like this, but the blood and goo on level 3? The Oni down the hall? This? I never thought I'd be dealing with any of this,
Todd said, still out of his element. To be honest, all of us were out of our element. None of us really knew the extent of anything we were dealing with. But with more funding rolling in from God only knows who, we at Icarus were really the only ones that were equipped to house and study these things to prevent them from slipping out into the world and causing extreme catastrophes. Then we were suddenly startled by the sound of a loud scream, echoing through the room where our heads immediately whipped around to see where the noise had come from. We then saw one of our female colleagues with her head in the mouth of what could only be described as a decaying man. His yellowed eyes bulging out of a withered, skull-like face as a massive jaw unhinged to envelop the entire screaming face of the poor woman. The beast's skin slipped off of his bones to then be replaced by new skin, which would in turn decay and slip away, leaving a mess of vile gunk upon the food he consumed and upon the floor beneath him. Another doctor, a man, tried to intervene and pull the woman away from his grasp, which resulted in the monster lashing out at him to bring him quickly into the embrace of death, holding the screaming doctor in arms that dug into his flesh, boiling it away and absorbing it into the creature's decayed body, the skin stretching and blistering as it was sucked into the beast that consumed it. An alarm sounded for a moment as thick metal doors sealed the room, containing everyone inside with this thing. This was followed by a thick glass ring coiling around to contain the subject within, and we were lucky to have this, because mere moments later, the entire interior of the glass containment ring was then covered from top to bottom in a layer of blood and gore. That would have been hell to clean up had we not added the extra layer of security. It was quite a cleanup effort, even with the added barrier. We would definitely have to study this thing further. After cleanup, we spent the next few days hitting this thing with various tests, exposing it to extreme temperatures on either end of the spectrum, pointing it into a mirror, blasting it with radiation. All these things had no effect. However, the thing would react when exposed to anything that would cause physical damage to it. When it was exposed to fire, it would lash out violently until the flame was extinguished by any means, as was the same with water. The being within the reaches of the glass would fight to spill any liquid that it feared as a threat. We're not certain if this being that is attached to this object is like a parasite to a host, or if the photograph is sentient in and of itself. After some time, we removed the wooden backing of the frame. After further testing, it was discovered that the wood frame was Dalbergia melanoxylian, or African blackwood, which brought a whole new mystery to the table. But even more intriguing was what we found upon the back of the photograph. A name. Agartha. A name that had no association to the photograph, according to its historical documentation. Perhaps it was the name of the photographer, or perhaps a previous owner. At the time we didn't know, but we didn't need long to find out. A man that had just been hired a couple weeks beforehand, apparently, didn't get the memo to not look at this thing directly. I happened to look over to see him staring directly into the photo from a few yards away. He stood there, as if completely mesmerized by what he saw within the picture. I yelled to him in an attempt to divert his gaze before the thing attacked. I was too late. I watched as the beast lurched out from the photograph like a blob of flesh at first, before almost instantly solidifying into the familiar shape of the decayed man. Then before anyone could react, the thing shot forward with such a force that it knocked the man off of his feet as it latched its large, snake-like mouth over the crown of the man's skull before jerking him backward toward the photograph, where it sought to consume him. The man struggled against the beast, and 3 nearby guards were quick to react, pulling back against the beast, playing tug-of-war with the man's body for the prize of his life. Finally, they were able to free the man from the thing's grasp, when its rotten teeth ripped through the man's flesh, clawing across his face before finally slipping off of his skull. The thing recoiled before it lashed out once more. We were thankfully able to save the man's life and stop the advancement of the beast with the glass safety shield once more, sealing it away inside. I'm not entirely certain how this thing was able to pass through the glass of the display, but not the glass of the safety shield. Perhaps it was the process in which the glass was made, having a content of minor imperfections consisting of iron and silver, giving it a kind of glittered-looking layer of glass, set between 2 thicker, more resistant glass layers. After we were finally able to calm the man, and he was given medication for the pain and to stop infection from the bite from the decaying being, we were finally able to talk to him. Well, I say we, but what I really mean is her. The woman in the office, our old supervisor, she questioned the fellow scientist.
What happened?
The woman asked calmly, but sternly.
I was walking by, and I happened to look over at the picture, and I felt peaceful. I saw it, and I wanted to be there.
The man answered.
Where did you want to be?
The woman asked.
I don't know. There was a garden, light shining in from above. bright, white light. Towers lined with shimmering gold. Great white waterfalls flowing out of the rivers overhead and down into their eyes. It was heaven. I really thought it was heaven.
The man said with a bit of a smile upon his face, before that smile was replaced with a look of shock, his eyes widening a bit and the corners of his mouth curling downward slightly.
Then I saw these things.
The man continued.
What kind of things?
The woman asked.
Spirits, monsters, devils, little imps scurrying about, and great beasts that reach beyond the towers. Horrible things. Tentacles, claws, gnawing mouths and twisting legs. Madness. Complete madness.
The man said, his eyes trailing off with a distant look, his mouth curling upward into a smile once more.
Then it had me. One of the things inside spotted me as I stood in its direct view. It was like I was there, feeling the heat, feeling the cold, feeling the madness, the burn of scalding waters, and the frost of crisp air. Then I felt the digging fangs of the creature that had me in its grasp. Its body changed from a kind of blue-tinted, almost white transparency rot and decay, as if it passed through the barrier of the glass between us.
The man said, as an almost indescribable look passed across his face before fading once more into a calm state. A look that was as if he was joyously suffering. He looked as if he were in ecstasy, while simultaneously his eyes filled with tears, and he was in extreme pain. It was very unsettling.
I see.
The woman said.
How do you feel now?
She asked.
It hurts. It hurts so much. But I want to go back there.
He answered, turning to look her in the eye as his tears dried up.
Does the name Agartha mean anything to you?
The woman asked. The man's look of desperation and wanting to return to his madness then changed to a look of confusion, with a hint of offense, as if the woman had said something outlandish.
No, not Agatha. Agartha?
The man corrected her, kind of confused by the words that came out of his mouth.
I don't know why I said that.
He continued.
Is there anything else you would like to tell me?
She asked the man, who was now holding his bandaged head in his hands.
No, I don't think so.
The man said, almost crying, before his tears dried up once more, and he looked back up at her again.
Can I go back there now?
He asked with a smile before the video ended. The photograph didn't say Agatha. It was aged and one of the letters had worn away. It said Agartha, a mythical city and cave system that is said to exist somewhere beneath Tibet. A place of evil, a place cursed, where demons called Asuras dwell. A place where the divide between the land of the living and the spirit realm is very thin. It was always thought of as a myth, but perhaps it's a real place. We brought this photograph to find answers, but we instead found more questions, and possibly a portal to a mythical city long thought to be just fairy tales. What more could we get ourselves into here? Only time will tell.
Well, maybe that will put some perspective on your next big buy. Then again, some items buy you, soul and all. But if what you own doesn't own you, make sure to drop by again next weekend. And until then, make sure to like, share, subscribe, and turn on notifications so I can catch you all again next Saturday.